In 2008, the government of Zimbabwe performed a magic trick that would have been comical if it were not so devastating. They made every single citizen a trillionaire. Within months, that currency would cease to exist entirely, erased from the face of the earth as though it had never been printed at all. This is the story of the second worst hyperinflation in recorded human history, a catastrophe that turned money itself into a worthless joke. At the peak of the madness, prices doubled not every year, not every month, but every 24 hours, making yesterday's fortune today's pocket change. A banknote bearing the number 100 trillion could not purchase a ticket for the morning bus, could not buy a loaf of bread, could not feed a child. The thieves who prowled the streets of Harare learned a new trick. They would rob their victims and dump the worthless cash on the ground, stealing only the wheelbarrow. But Zimbabwe was not always a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of economics departments. It was once the jewel of southern Africa. When the country gained its independence from Britain in 1980, international observers called it the Breadbasket of Africa, a nation overflowing with agricultural wealth and promise. On the day of independence, one Zimbabwean dollar was actually worth more than one United States dollar, a fact that seems almost impossible to believe today. The nation boasted strong agricultural exports, a functioning banking system, educated professionals, and some of the most impressive economic statistics on the entire African continent. Life expectancy was climbing steadily upward, unemployment remained manageable, and the future stretched out before the young nation like a golden road. Robert Mugabe, the revolutionary leader who had spent years fighting for independence in the Bush War, ascended to become the country's first prime minister amid great celebration. He was hailed as a liberator by millions of black Zimbabweans who had suffered under the brutal machinery of colonial rule and white minority government. But beneath the hopeful surface of this newly independent nation, deep structural fractures were already forming in the bedrock of the economy. The seeds of hyperinflation were planted in Zimbabwean soil long before the first trillion-dollar note ever rolled off the printing press in desperation. To understand how money died in Zimbabwe, how a currency was murdered by its own government, we must follow the trail of three fatal decisions. Each decision seemed logical at the time, even defensible, perhaps even necessary in the minds of those who made them. But together, like 3 drops of poison in a well, they would destroy an entire nation's accumulated wealth and condemn millions to poverty. The first crack in the foundation appeared on November 14, 1997, a date that would be seared into the national memory forever as Black Friday. War veterans who had fought in the liberation struggle of the 1970s had been gathering in the streets for months, their anger building like pressure in a sealed container. These men demanded compensation for the years they had spent in the bush, fighting and bleeding and watching their comrades die to secure Zimbabwe's independence. Their leader, a fiery physician named Chenjerai Hunzvi, organized marches on State House and publicly heckled Robert Mugabe during his own Heroes' Day speech. Under immense political pressure, feeling the foundations of his power beginning to tremble, Mugabe made a decision that would haunt his nation for decades. He ordered his finance minister to release 4.2 billion Zimbabwean dollars immediately to over 50,000 war veterans demanding their due. Each veteran received a payment of $50,000, which at the time was roughly equivalent to 2,000 United States dollars in purchasing power. The problem was devastatingly simple. This money did not exist anywhere in the national budget. It was conjured from nothing but political desperation. The payout represented a full 3% of Zimbabwe's entire gross domestic product, materialized out of thin air to quiet an angry mob. The reaction of the financial markets was immediate, brutal, and utterly without mercy for the Zimbabwean currency. On that single Black Friday, the Zimbabwean dollar crashed by 71.5% against the US dollar, a collapse that defied all historical precedent. The Zimbabwe Stock Exchange hemorrhaged 46% of its entire value in the space of one trading day, wiping out fortunes accumulated over decades. By a cruel coincidence that seemed almost biblical in its symbolism, a national electricity blackout struck the country on that very same day. Foreign investors, watching their portfolios evaporate before their eyes, fled for the exits like passengers abandoning a sinking ship. The American fast food giant McDonald's, which had been preparing to open its first outlet in Zimbabwe, quietly cancelled its plans and never looked back. Foreign currency reserves, which had stood at a comfortable $760 million in January, plunged to a desperate $255 million by November. The central bank, which had been able to guarantee 3 months of imports at the year's start, could now barely cover a single month of the nation's needs. But Robert Mugabe, having made one catastrophic financial decision, was not finished gambling with his nation's economic future. In August of 1998, Zimbabwe marched into the Second Congo War, a conflict so vast and bloody that historians would come to call it Africa's World War. This sprawling conflict would eventually draw in 9 African nations and at least 25 different armed groups fighting across the jungles of Central Africa. Mugabe deployed 6,000 Zimbabwean soldiers deep into the Congo to support President Laurent Kabila against rebel forces backed by Rwanda and Uganda. The military operation was given the grandiose name Operation Sovereignty Legitimacy, as if noble words could disguise the financial ruin it would bring. In public speeches, Mugabe framed the intervention as an act of African solidarity, a principled defense of a fellow leader against foreign-backed rebellion. But behind closed doors, Mugabe had signed contracts worth $200 million involving mining concessions for corporations connected to his own family. The war consumed resources at a staggering rate, costing the Zimbabwean treasury an estimated $1 million every single day. Leaked government documents would later reveal that between January and June of 2000 alone, Zimbabwe hemorrhaged $166 million on military operations. To fund this foreign adventure that enriched the elite while impoverishing the nation, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe began printing money at rates never before seen. The government printed 21 trillion Zimbabwean dollars simply to pay off debts owed to the International Monetary Fund, a desperate act of financial desperation. Western donors, watching the fiscal chaos with growing alarm, began suspending their aid programs one by one until the pipeline of assistance ran dry. Since you've made it this far, you're clearly enjoying the content, so why not hit subscribe and drop a like? It really helps out. All right, let's keep going. By 1999, Zimbabwe had defaulted on most of its foreign debt, becoming a pariah in the international financial system it had once proudly participated in. The third and most catastrophic decision came in the year 2000, when Mugabe launched what he called the Fast-Track Land Reform Program. The stated goal was to correct a genuine historical injustice, redistributing farmland from white commercial farmers to the black Zimbabweans who had been dispossessed. At independence in 1980, approximately 4,200 white farmers, representing less than 1% of the population, controlled over 70% of the arable land. This grotesque imbalance was a direct legacy of colonial seizures, a wound that had never healed and festered in the national consciousness. Land reform was not merely a political slogan, but a legitimate grievance rooted in the brutal history of dispossession and exploitation. But the execution of this reform was not justice, it was chaos, and that chaos would destroy the agricultural foundation upon which the nation depended. Beginning in 2000, mobs of supporters from Mugabe's ruling party began violently invading white-owned farms across the country in coordinated waves. Armed men would arrive at farmhouse doors at dawn with a simple message that left no room for negotiation: leave this place now or die. At least 7 white farmers were killed during these invasions, murdered on the land their families had worked for generations. More than 4,000 white commercial farmers were driven from their properties, often with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The seized farms were redistributed, but the primary beneficiaries were not the poor black farmers who had been promised justice for colonial wrongs. Instead, the most productive land was handed to Mugabe loyalists, government officials, military officers, and their families as rewards for political support. The vast majority of these new owners had never planted a seed in their lives, had never operated a tractor, had never managed irrigation systems. They lacked the agricultural knowledge, the technical expertise, and the capital to maintain the sophisticated commercial farming operations they had seized. Satellite photographs taken before and after the land reform tell a story more eloquent than any economic report or political speech. Where once there had been lush green fields dotted with reservoirs and irrigation channels, there was now only parched brown earth returning to wilderness. The dams that had been carefully maintained for decades cracked and crumbled, the irrigation systems rusted and failed, and the land died. In 2001, Zimbabwe had been the sixth largest tobacco producer on the entire planet, its golden leaf a source of enormous foreign currency earnings. By 2008, tobacco production had collapsed to just 21% of what it had been at the turn of the millennium, an agricultural apocalypse. Food production across the country fell by 45%, transforming the breadbasket of Africa into a nation that could not feed itself. The country that had once exported surplus grain to hungry neighbors now stretched out its hand to beg for international food aid. Manufacturing output collapsed by 29% in 2005, then by another 26% in 2006, and yet another 28% in 2007. The banking sector, which had provided the credit that kept farms running and factories humming, collapsed as loans could never be repaid. Unemployment soared to an almost unimaginable 80% of the working-age population, leaving the vast majority of Zimbabweans with no legitimate income. Life expectancy, which had been climbing steadily since independence, reversed course and began falling toward levels not seen since the colonial era. By 2005, the average Zimbabwean's purchasing power had fallen to where it had been in 1953, erasing half a century of economic progress. With agricultural exports destroyed and tax revenue collapsing into a black hole, the government faced a terrible question: how would it pay its bills? There was only one answer available to a regime that refused to change course, and that answer was the printing press. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, led by Governor Gideon Gono from December 2003 onward, responded to every crisis by manufacturing more money. A leaked American diplomatic cable would later quote an IMF mission chief describing Gono as, quote, the world's worst central banker by far, unquote. But calling it printing money barely begins to capture the industrial scale of the monetary madness that consumed Zimbabwe. The Reserve Bank was importing banknotes from a German security printing company called Giesecke and Devrient, paying precious foreign currency for worthless paper. By March 2008, the Munich firm was receiving more than 500,000 euros per week to deliver notes worth 170 trillion Zimbabwean dollars. Think about the absurdity of that transaction, spending real money that the country desperately needed to import fake money that nobody wanted. Inflation, which had hovered around a manageable 10% throughout the 1980s, began its exponential climb toward the stratosphere. In 2001, the annual inflation rate crossed the psychologically important threshold of 100%, signaling that something had gone terribly wrong. By 2003, the rate had reached nearly 600%, and the value of savings accumulated over lifetimes began to evaporate. In 2006, inflation hit 1,281%, and the World Bank declared Zimbabwe the fastest shrinking economy outside an active war zone. By 2007, the official government inflation rate stood at 66,000%. Though independent economists calculated the true figure was far worse. In July 2007, facing an inflationary spiral that was spinning out of all control, the government made a decision that would have been laughable if it were not so tragic. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe officially declared inflation itself to be illegal, as if economic reality could be commanded away by government decree. The central bank announced that any person caught raising prices or wages between March and June would be arrested and punished like a common criminal. Police officers across the country received orders to imprison business owners who refused to slash their prices by 50% or more on government command. Within weeks, more than 2,000 company owners and executives found themselves in handcuffs, arrested for the crime of responding to economic reality. Businesses that could not sell their goods at a loss below their production costs did the only thing they could do. They closed their doors forever. Store shelves that had been fully stocked on Monday morning stood completely empty by Friday afternoon, stripped bare as if by locusts. Basic necessities like soap, sugar, cooking oil, and bread vanished entirely from official markets, available only to those with foreign currency. A thriving black market emerged from the shadows, where the real prices were charged, and only those with dollars or connections could eat. Workers who had been earning the equivalent of $11 per month discovered they could make $166 trading on the black market. In July 2007, the government quietly stopped publishing official inflation statistics altogether, hoping that if no one saw the numbers, the crisis would disappear. Observers around the world recognized this for what it was, a desperate attempt to hide the magnitude of the economic apocalypse unfolding in Harare. In 2008, the situation that had seemed impossible to worsen somehow managed to get unimaginably worse. Inflation accelerated from over 100,000% in January to over 1,000,000% by May, numbers that seemed to belong to science fiction. By July, the rate had reached 250 million%, and mathematicians began running out of words to describe what was happening. Then came November 2008, the month that would earn Zimbabwe its place in the record books of human economic catastrophe. The monthly inflation rate reached 79.6 billion%, a number so large that it loses all meaning to the human mind. When you compound that monthly rate over a full year, you get a figure that requires scientific notation to even write down: 89.7 sextillion%. For those keeping count, that is the number 89.7 followed by 21 zeros, a figure beyond comprehension. This was the second highest hyperinflation rate ever recorded in the entirety of human history, exceeded only by Hungary in the chaos following World War II. At this rate of monetary destruction, prices were effectively doubling every single day, making financial planning literally impossible. One United States dollar became equivalent to 2.6 trillion Zimbabwean dollars, though that exchange rate changed hour by hour. What did this abstract economic catastrophe mean for the ordinary Zimbabweans trying to survive in the wreckage of their national economy? It meant that the money in your pocket when you woke up in the morning would buy only half as much by the time you went to bed. Workers would receive their wages and literally sprint to the nearest market, knowing that every minute of delay meant money evaporating from their hands. A bus fare that cost one price in the morning would cost double that amount for the evening commute home from work. If you were foolish enough to write a check for a purchase, you had to write it for twice the cash price to account for the inflation before it cleared. Restaurants across the country stopped printing menus entirely because the prices would change multiple times while customers sat eating their meals. In 2006, before the worst of the hyperinflation had even arrived, a single sheet of toilet paper cost 417 Zimbabwean dollars. Not a roll of toilet paper, not a package, but a single individual sheet, highlighting the absurdity of what money had become. By mid-2008, 100 billion Zimbabwean dollars, a sum that would once have made someone unimaginably wealthy, could purchase exactly 3 eggs. People carried their worthless money in wheelbarrows, in suitcases, in garbage bags, because wallets could not hold enough bills to buy lunch. The streets of Harare witnessed scenes that would have seemed like dark comedy if they were not happening to real people facing real starvation. Thieves who robbed their victims quickly learned to steal the wheelbarrows and dump the cash, because the barrow was worth more than its contents. The ATM machines across the country stopped functioning entirely because their computer systems could not process numbers containing so many zeros. One major bank's automated teller machines began displaying data overflow error messages when customers attempted to make withdrawals from their accounts. By the time technicians reprogrammed the machines to handle withdrawals of $100 billion, that amount could no longer purchase a single loaf of bread. The Reserve Bank responded to the crisis in the only way it knew how, by printing banknotes with ever more zeros on their face. First came the $1 million notes, then the 10 million, then the 100 million, each denomination obsolete before it reached circulation. Then came the $1 billion notes, cluttering wallets and purses with paper that depreciated faster than it could be spent. Then the $10 billion notes, then the 100 billion, each new denomination a monument to the failure of monetary policy. In January 2009, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe issued the $100 trillion note, the banknote with the most zeros of any legal tender in human history. And still it was not enough, still it could not buy what a single dollar had purchased a decade before. The government attempted to reset the disaster by redenominating the currency 3 separate times, slashing zeros and hoping for a fresh start. In August 2006, they removed 3 zeros from the currency, exchanging 1,000 old dollars for 1 new dollar in a futile gesture. In July 2008, they removed 10 more zeros, admitting that the first redenomination had accomplished nothing at all. In February 2009, they removed yet another 12 zeros, bringing the total number of zeros erased to 25. By the final redenomination, the fourth Zimbabwean dollar was worth 10 to the 25th power of the original first dollar from independence. But none of it mattered. None of the redenominations, none of the new currencies, none of the government promises of stability. Each new currency lost whatever credibility it briefly possessed as quickly as the last one had failed. The Zimbabwean people had simply lost all faith in any promise their government made about the value of money. By late 2008, the formal economy of Zimbabwe had essentially ceased to function as a modern system of exchange. People conducted their business in smuggled US dollars on the black market or reverted to pure barter, trading eggs for haircuts and chickens for medicine. An estimated 3 to 4 million Zimbabweans, representing the vast majority of the country's skilled workforce, abandoned their homeland entirely. Most of these refugees fled south to South Africa, where they sought the stability and opportunity that their own country could no longer provide. Those who remained behind faced not merely poverty, but a comprehensive humanitarian catastrophe affecting every aspect of daily existence. Hospitals ran out of medicine, bandages, and even clean water, leaving the sick to die for lack of the most basic supplies. Schools could not afford to pay teachers or purchase books, abandoning an entire generation of children to ignorance. Clean tap water, which had once been taken for granted, now ran only once a week in many urban areas. Half the population struggled to obtain even a single meal each day, hunger becoming the constant companion of millions. Finally, in early 2009, the government of Zimbabwe was forced to admit what everyone already knew: the currency was dead beyond resurrection. The Zimbabwean dollar was officially abandoned, erased from existence after less than 3 decades of increasingly troubled life. Foreign currencies, primarily the US dollar and the South African rand, were legalized as the only acceptable tender for transactions. The currency that had once been worth more than the American dollar was now worth absolutely nothing, not even the paper it was printed on. In 2015, the government performed the final funeral rites, officially demonetizing the old currency and removing it from circulation. They offered to exchange whatever worthless notes citizens still possessed at a rate of $5 per wheelbarrow load of bills. The hyperinflation was finally over, but the lessons written in the suffering of millions would echo through economic history forever. Zimbabwe stands as the ultimate proof of what happens when governments choose the printing press over fiscal discipline and political courage. It demonstrates with brutal clarity how the destruction of property rights can collapse agricultural production and unravel an entire national economy. It proves beyond any doubt that declaring inflation illegal does nothing to stop it, that economic reality cannot be outlawed. And it shows that when a people lose faith in their money, they lose faith in the entire system that money was supposed to represent. In 2008, the government of Zimbabwe made every one of its citizens a trillionaire, the cruelest joke in economic history. Within months, that currency no longer existed, and the people who had been trillionaires discovered they had nothing at all. If you found this perspective valuable, consider subscribing. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. Thank you for watching.